My childhood was a relentless battle for validation. I was the eldest, the quiet observer, constantly trying to navigate a world that seemed to effortlessly embrace my younger brother, Leo. Leo was the golden boy, charismatic, effortlessly charming, with a natural flair for everything from sports to public speaking. My parents, successful entrepreneurs who built their empire from the ground up, saw their reflection in Leo's ambition and dazzling social graces. They were demanding, driven people, and while they provided for me lavishly, their affection felt conditional, a prize to be earned through achievement, through conformity to their lofty expectations. For Leo, approval seemed to flow effortlessly. For me, it was a constant, uphill climb. Their company, a thriving manufacturing business, was more than just a source of wealth, it was the very cornerstone of our family identity. It was their legacy, their pride, the topic of every dinner conversation, the unspoken expectation that both Leo and I would one day step into its hallowed halls. Leo embraced it, his eyes alight with visions of corporate power. I, however, found myself drawn to different paths, to art, to design, to a quieter, more independent way of creating. This divergence, this refusal to fit into their meticulously planned future for me, was where the cracks first began to show. They never explicitly called me a failure, not in so many words, but the message was clear in their disappointed sighs, their thinly veiled comparisons to Leo's achievements, their constant suggestions that I be more like your brother. My artistic pursuits were dismissed as hobbies, my dreams of independent creation as unrealistic fantasies. Leo's most trivial business ventures, no matter how ill-conceived, were celebrated with fanfare. I was always the one told to get serious, to focus on what matters. I absorbed their subtle disapproval like a slow-acting poison, internalizing the belief that I was inherently lacking, destined to fall short of their monumental expectations. Looking back, the emotional distance grew into a chasm. My parents, once so involved in every aspect of our lives, gradually began to withdraw their emotional investment from me, channeling all their energy and pride into Leo. He became their proxy, their perfect heir. I found myself increasingly isolated, spending more time in my own world, sketching, designing, building things with my hands, seeking solace in the tangible act of creation, far from the critical gaze of my family. I never stopped trying to earn their love, their approval, but the effort became exhausting, the rewards increasingly scarce. My brother, Leo, was a master manipulator, though I didn't see it clearly then. He'd subtly undermine me, twisting my words, exaggerating my perceived flaws, all while maintaining an air of innocent concern. If I voiced a different opinion during a family discussion about the company, he'd gently suggest I didn't quite grasp the business side of things. If I pursued a new artistic project, he'd feign interest, then casually remark on the financial instability of creative careers, echoing our parents' unspoken fears. He always seemed to know exactly how to push my buttons, how to highlight my deficiencies in my parents' eyes, all while maintaining his golden boy image. I didn't realize then that these were not just cracks, but gaping chasms, hinting at a truth far more profound and sinister than I could comprehend. A persistent peculiarity was their sudden obsession with my financial status. As I began my career, building my own small design studio, my parents would constantly inquire about my income, my savings, always with a subtle undertone of concern, almost suspicion. They'd warn me about the dangers of risky ventures, urging me to consider a safer path, a path that led back to their company. I assumed it was parental worry, a natural concern for their child's well-being. I didn't realize then that their scrutiny was not born of love, but of a subtle, calculated assessment, a quiet justification for a future decision they were already contemplating. The most unsettling crack, though, was their unwavering belief in Leo, even when his decisions were clearly flawed. He made several risky business investments outside the family company, often losing substantial sums. My parents, instead of reprimanding him, would bail him out, whispering about learning experiences and youthful exuberance. Their faith in his eventual success remained unshaken, unwavering, even as his failures mounted. My own careful, methodical progress, my slow but steady growth, was rarely acknowledged with the same fervent enthusiasm. I knew I was different. I just didn't know how fundamentally different, how entirely out of their chosen narrative, I had truly become. I didn't realize then that their love, their acceptance, was a transaction, and I was about to be deemed unworthy of the final payout. The climax arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a whispered phone call. It was a cold, late winter evening. I was at my small studio, sketching designs, when my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was hushed, almost frantic, laced with a familiar note of panic. "Your father, he's in the hospital. A massive stroke." My world tilted. My father, the bedrock of our family, indestructible, invincible. Now frail, hospitalized, his future uncertain. I rushed to the hospital, my mind a blur of fear and fragmented memories. Leo was already there, pacing the waiting room, his face pale, but his eyes holding a strange, almost calculating flicker beneath the veneer of concern. My mother, Maria, was weeping silently beside my father's bed, her hand clutching his. He was unconscious, hooked up to machines, his breathing shallow. The doctors offered little hope. A few days later, my father passed away. The funeral was a somber affair, a gathering of family, friends, and business associates. Amidst the quiet grief, the whispers began about the future of the company, about his will, about the legacy he had built. It was a monumental inheritance, a sprawling empire. I prepared myself for the inevitable. I knew Leo would take the helm, that he was their chosen successor. I merely hoped for a small, symbolic share, a recognition of my place in the family, a quiet acknowledgement of my existence. The reading of the will was held a week later, in the austere office of the family attorney, Mr. Davies. My mother, Leo, and I sat in heavy silence as the lawyer began to read. The initial clauses were as expected: charitable donations, trusts for grandchildren not yet born. Then came the heart of it, the company, the vast majority of the family's wealth, the intricate network of investments. It was all bequeathed to Leo, with specific instructions for him to lead and expand the family business. I felt a familiar ache of disappointment, but not surprise. I was prepared for this. I braced myself for the silence that would signify my minimal share. But then, Mr. Davies continued reading, his voice devoid of emotion, moving to the clause pertaining to me. My breath hitched. My heart stopped. "And to my eldest son, Mark, I leave the sum of $1, as a symbolic gesture of his chosen path of independence, and his clear desire to forge his own destiny, separate from the family legacy. A single dollar. As a symbolic gesture. Not an oversight. Not an error. A deliberate, calculated act. A public, legal disinheritance." The words echoed in my head, cold, sharp, devastating. My father. My mother, who sat silently beside Leo, her face unreadable. They had planned this. They had gone through the legal steps to ensure my complete, utter exclusion. My independence, my uniqueness, the very qualities that made me who I was, were not celebrated. They were punished. The world went silent, then exploded into a million shattering pieces. It was like a sudden, brutal awakening, a blinding flash of lightning that illuminated the darkest corners of my life. My father, who had been my bedrock. My mother, who had nurtured me. They hadn't simply favored Leo, they had actively disowned me, financially, emotionally, legally. They had deemed me unworthy, a failure in their eyes, so completely that they bequeathed me a single, humiliating dollar. The emotional chaos was instant, overwhelming. Heartbreak for the shattered illusion of their love, a searing, guttural pain that twisted inside me, knowing their affection had always been conditional, a performance I had failed to master. Anger at them, a hot, venomous rage that pulsed through my veins, consuming me, for their cold calculation, their profound betrayal, the way they had judged me, dismissed me, for being myself. Shame, for being so blind, so naive, so utterly fooled by the people I had trusted implicitly, whose approval I had spent a lifetime chasing. And silence. A deafening, echoing silence in that sterile legal office, a silence that magnified the screams in my head. My life. My identity. My sense of belonging. All of it, obliterated in a single, devastating moment. The parents who were supposed to be my champions, my protectors, were systematically erasing me from their legacy, disowning me financially, emotionally, as if my very existence was a mark of shame. They had judged me, weighed my worth against their expectations, and found me wanting. Leo sat beside my mother, his face a mask of solemnity, but his eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a flicker of triumph, a chilling confirmation of his ultimate victory. And that's when I realized, they never loved me the way I loved them. What came after was a raw, visceral struggle for survival. I didn't want revenge that would just burn everything down. I wanted truth, justice, and a chance to reclaim my life, my self-worth, my own definition of success. I needed peace, and peace wouldn't come from silence or passive acceptance of this monstrous slight. I walked out of that lawyer's office, the weight of $1 in my pocket feeling heavier than any inheritance. My mother tried to offer a hesitant apology, a strained explanation about your father's wishes, but her words were meaningless, drowned out by the roar of betrayal in my ears. I looked at Leo, his face carefully composed, ready to step into his inherited empire. I simply turned and walked away, leaving behind the facade of family, leaving behind the ghosts of a love that was never truly mine. The next few months were a blur of numb existence. I poured myself into my work, my design studio becoming my sanctuary, my escape. The pain was a constant companion, a dull ache that never truly subsided. I felt a profound sense of isolation, haunted by the public, legal disinheritance. How could I tell anyone? The shame, the humiliation, the sheer injustice of it, kept me trapped in a silent agony. I was a professional, a man of logic and reason, but this emotional wound was beyond comprehension. I considered all my options, desperate to find a way to cope with this monumental betrayal. My initial instinct was pure, unadulterated rage, to expose them, to publicly denounce their cruelty, to shatter their carefully constructed image. But a colder, more calculated part of my mind took over. What would that truly achieve? More pain? More drama? I needed something more profound than a single, destructive act. My revenge needed to be about justice, about reclaiming my narrative, about finding a peace that transcended their cruelty, a success that dwarfed their shallow definitions. My first step was to detach. Emotionally. Financially. I had always been independent, but now, I began a conscious, deliberate severance. I stopped accepting their polite invitations, citing my demanding work schedule, slowly creating an unbridgeable distance. When my mother called, I kept conversations brief, polite, but devoid of any genuine warmth. She noticed, of course. She would sound puzzled, sometimes hurt, but she never probed too deeply, perhaps afraid of what she might uncover, afraid of the chasm she herself had created. My true revenge began quietly, meticulously, in the silent hours of my studio, and in the calculated expansion of my own business. While Leo inherited a sprawling, traditional manufacturing company, I doubled down on my passion, innovative, sustainable design. I invested every penny I had, every ounce of my energy, into my small studio. I embraced my differentness, my unique perspective, the very qualities they had dismissed as flaws. I networked tirelessly, found investors who believed in my vision, and built a team that shared my passion for creativity and integrity. I started small, yes, but my ideas were fresh, my execution flawless, and my products began to gain traction in niche markets. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate about the family company. Leo, despite his charm, lacked my father's shrewd business acumen and my methodical planning. He was impulsive, prone to grand, ill-conceived schemes, much like his personal life. The market was changing, too, shifting towards sustainability and custom craftsmanship, areas where my father's traditional manufacturing struggled. Leo, blinded by his inherited power, refused to adapt, clinging to old methods, making increasingly risky decisions. The financial strain on the company began to show, quietly at first, then more overtly. I kept abreast of the news, not with joy, but with a grim sense of inevitability. The opportunity, the moment for my ultimate reclamation, arrived almost a decade after my disinheritance. The family company, once a titan, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, crippled by Leo's mismanagement, market shifts, and mounting debts. They needed a bailout, a buyer, desperately. My mother, frantic, called me, pleading for advice, for help. They had exhausted all other options. Leo, humbled but still proud, was forced to admit defeat. My lawyer, a shrewd operator I had retained years ago for my own business, presented a proposal. My company, now a quietly successful, innovative leader in sustainable manufacturing, would buy out their struggling empire. Not as a rescue, but as an acquisition. On my terms. The meeting was held in the very same austere legal office where I had been disinherited. My mother was there, her face drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of despair and a dawning, terrible understanding. Leo sat beside her, his once confident posture slumped, his charm completely gone, replaced by a sullen resentment. Mr. Davies, the family attorney, avoided my gaze. I sat across from them, calm, composed, my own success a quiet, undeniable presence. I presented my offer, a fair market price, but one that stripped them of their control, their legacy, their pride. It was a purely business transaction, devoid of emotion. They tried to negotiate, to plead, to inject sentiment into the cold financial terms. My mother spoke of family, of honoring your father's memory. My father, I said, my voice steady, devoid of a tremor, made his wishes clear. He left me $1. A symbolic gesture. I'm simply reciprocating that gesture, in kind. This is a business decision. Nothing more. The look on Leo's face, a mixture of shock, fury, and utter defeat, was the closest I came to feeling true satisfaction. My mother's eyes, filled with tears, met mine. In that moment, I saw it, the full, crushing realization of their colossal error, the devastating consequence of their conditional love, their blindness. They had dismissed me as the failure, chosen him, erased me from their legacy. And now, the failure was buying their empire. I bought their company. I didn't dismantle it, I restructured it, modernized it, infused it with the very principles of innovation and sustainability they had dismissed. I kept the loyal employees, revitalized the brand, and turned it into a symbol of my own vision, my own success. I brought it out of the shadows of their outdated ideology and into the light of a new era. My revenge wasn't about vindictiveness, it was about justice and reclamation. It was about bringing truth to light, about dismantling the lies that had shaped my entire life, and about asserting my right to be seen, truly seen, for who I am. I didn't destroy them, I transcended them. I allowed their choices to be their own punishment. My relationship with my mother remained strained, a landscape forever scarred by their decision. She continued to carry the weight of her regret, her quiet shame. Leo, utterly defeated, drifted into obscurity, his charm and ambition withered by the public knowledge of his failures and my rise. I didn't cut ties completely with my mother, but the bond was irrevocably changed, replaced by a polite, distant acknowledgement. I didn't want revenge. I needed peace. And that peace began to bloom when I accepted that my story wasn't about their failures, but about my resilience. It was about standing up for the truth, about fighting for my own worth, about proving that I could emerge from the wreckage stronger, wiser, and infinitely more whole. I learned that sometimes, the greatest betrayals lead to the most profound discoveries about yourself, about self-worth, and about the true meaning of family. My journey was painful, but it led me to a profound understanding of who I am, and who truly protects my heart.